The hum of the lunchtime service was a low-grade fever in Simone's bones. It was a constant thrum of clinking silver, murmured conversations, and the relentless squeak of her own sensible shoes on the polished dark wood. 3 hours down, 4 to go. Fatigue was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making the starched white of her uniform feel like a shroud. She moved through the maze of tables with an economy of motion born from 2 weeks of double shifts, her mind a sterile ledger of orders, table numbers, and water levels. The restaurant, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a sun-drenched city street, was an oasis of calm opulence, a world away from the student loan statements and overdue rent notices that waited for her at home. She was a ghost in this machine of quiet luxury, efficient and invisible. That was the goal, to be so good at her job that she disappeared completely. Then came Table 12, tucked into the most private alcove, a dark corner in a room full of light. The reservation was under a single name, Mr. Kong, but 4 men occupied the chairs. They were all dressed in suits so dark and exquisitely tailored they seemed to absorb the light around them. They didn't speak loudly. Their voices were soft as velvet, but the silence that fell around their table was a living thing, a perimeter of deference and fear. Even the seasoned manager, a man who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, gave the table a wide berth, his instructions to Simone delivered in a hushed, urgent tone. Just water, unless they ask.
No specials. No chatter.
Understand. Simone understood. She had served rich men, powerful men, arrogant men. But these men were different. There was a stillness about them, a coiled potential for violence that was as palpable as the scent of expensive cologne. The man at the head of the table, presumably Mr. Kong, was the center of that stillness. He wasn't the largest or the oldest, but the other 3 men orbited him like nervous planets. He had hair the color of jet, threaded with the barest hint of silver at the temples, and a face that was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes. He hadn't looked at her once. His attention was a heavy, focused thing, directed solely at the men he was with. Simone refilled their water glasses, her movements small and precise, trying to shrink herself, to become nothing more than a hand and a pitcher. He watched the girl. Minjun had built an empire on his ability to watch, to see the fractures in a person's facade, the tells they never knew they had. This waitress, she was new. He had never seen her before. She was tired. It was evident in the slight violet smudges beneath her eyes and the rigid set of her spine, a conscious effort to fight the pull of gravity. Yet her hands were steady. Her movements were clean, without wasted energy. Competence. He respected competence. His associates were talking, their words a predictable flow of threats, percentages, and territory disputes. It was the language of his world, a language he had mastered before he could properly grow a beard. He was bored of it. He was bored of the fear and the feigned respect in the eyes of the men across from him. They were all predators, circling, waiting for a moment of weakness. His gaze drifted back to the waitress as she cleared plates from a nearby table. She smiled at an elderly couple, a small, genuine thing that briefly erased the exhaustion from her face. It was like watching a different person emerge for a flicker of a second. The contrast was jarring. How could a person hold both that weariness and that light? His business was one of absolutes. Strength or weakness. Loyalty or betrayal. Life or death. There was no room for nuance. And yet, this girl, in her simple white uniform, was a walking contradiction. A problem without a clear variable. The discussion at his table had reached an impasse. One of his lieutenants, a man named Choi, was arguing for a brutal, decisive action against a new rival. Another, Park, advocated for a more subtle approach, a slow strangulation of resources. They looked to him for the final word, their faces masks of eager deference. But Minjun's mind was elsewhere, caught on the image of that fleeting smile. He raised a hand, silencing them both. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. He waited until the waitress was near their table again, her tray laden with empty glasses. "Waitress," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room's ambient noise like a razor. Every head at the table, and several nearby, turned. Simone froze. The voice was low, resonant, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. For the first time, the man, Mr. Kong, was looking directly at her. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. They weren't unkind, but they were not kind either. They were assessing, weighing. She felt pinned by his gaze, a specimen under a microscope. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was it. She had done something wrong. Dropped a fork, let a water glass get too low, breathed too loudly. The manager's warning echoed in her head.
No chatter.
Yes, sir? Her own voice was a stranger's, thin and reedy. The other men at the table stared at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. They were not accustomed to their leader being interrupted, let alone initiating an interruption with the staff. The Korean Mafia boss leaned forward slightly, his hands steepled on the table. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Simone's mind raced. Was this a test? A game? She just wanted to finish her shift, go home, and sleep for a week. I have a question for you, he said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. A hypothetical, Simone swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She wanted to look away, to break the intensity of his focus, but she couldn't. It felt like a physical force holding her in place. Imagine a king, he began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. This king has 2 sons. The first son is fiercely loyal. He would die for his father without a moment's hesitation. But he is weak. He lacks vision and cunning. The second son is brilliant, ambitious. He sees opportunities no one else does. But his loyalty is conditional. He serves the throne, but you are never certain if he doesn't desire it for himself. The king must choose an heir to protect his kingdom. Who does he choose? The loyal fool or the brilliant traitor? The room was utterly still. The other mafia bosses looked from Minjun to Simone, their faces hard with disbelief. This was not a question for a waitress. This was a thinly veiled discussion of their own world, of succession and trust. They were waiting for her to stammer, to apologize for her inability to answer, to shrink back into the invisibility required of her. For a long moment, Simone said nothing. Her brain, fogged with exhaustion, tried to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. A powerful Korean mafia boss was asking her, a 22-year-old art history major slinging overpriced salads to pay her tuition, for advice on a Machiavellian succession dilemma. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to demur, to say, I'm sorry, sir, that's not my place. It was the safe answer, the smart answer, the one that would allow her to melt back into the background. But the fatigue that weighed her down also burned away the finer points of social fear. She was too tired to be diplomatic. And something else, a stubborn little spark of defiance she didn't know she possessed, took offense at the premise of the question itself. It was a trap, a question with no right answer, designed to reveal a person's calculus of power. She looked directly at Mr. Kong, meeting his unwavering gaze. That's the wrong question, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. One of the men beside him actually flinched. Another's jaw tightened in anger. Mr. Kong, however, did not react. His expression remained one of placid curiosity. He simply tilted his head, a silent invitation to continue. The king's duty isn't to choose between 2 flawed options, Simone elaborated, the words coming out before she could stop them. His duty is to rule. If one son is loyal but weak, the king has failed to teach him strength. If the other is brilliant but treacherous, the king has failed to teach him honor. His dilemma isn't about succession. It's a reflection of his own failure as a leader and a father. The real question is, why did he let his sons become such poor choices? She finished, her breath catching in her throat. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just tense, it was stunned. She had not played the game. She had thrown the board off the table. She had taken his cold, strategic hypothetical and turned it into a question of morality and responsibility. She had, in front of his most powerful lieutenants, implicitly called the theoretical king a failure. Minjun felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate grinding into a new position. He had asked that question dozens of times over the years, to his advisors, to his rivals, to himself. The answers were always the same, a predictable spectrum of strategic calculations. Empower the loyal one and rule through him. Use the brilliant one but watch your back. Kill the treacherous one. No one had ever challenged the premise. No one had ever dared to turn the judgment back onto the king. He watched her, this young woman with tired eyes and an unyielding spine, and felt a profound, startling sense of discovery. She saw the world through a different lens, one unclouded by the relentless pursuit of power. She saw the human element, the failure of a father, the duty of a leader. In her world, strength was not just about cunning, and loyalty was not a tool to be wielded. They were qualities to be nurtured.
Honor.
It was a word he rarely heard, a concept that had been ground down to dust in his line of work. Yet, she said it with such simple, unadorned conviction. His lieutenants were staring at her as if she had grown a second head. Choi looked furious, insulted on his boss's behalf. Park looked intrigued, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. Min-jun, however, felt none of their shock or anger. He felt seen, not as a mafia boss, not as a figure of fear, but as the theoretical king, being held to a higher standard. He finally broke the silence. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a rare event that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by sheer bewilderment. "Thank you," he said to her, his voice imbued with a warmth that hadn't been there before. "That is the most intelligent answer I have received," he then turned to his men. "The discussion is over. We will not move against them. We will find another way." He had made his decision, not based on their advice, but on the moral clarity of a stranger. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he needed to know her name. He needed to know more than her name. He needed to understand the world that produced such an answer. That single interaction changed the rhythm of Simone's life. Mr. Kong, she soon learned his full name was Kong Min-jun, became a regular fixture. He would arrive for lunch too, sometimes 3 times a week, always alone and always requesting her section. The first few times, the manager was a nervous wreck, hovering nearby, but Min-jun's demeanor was impeccable. He was a quiet, almost solitary customer. He never made demands. He read a newspaper or a thin book, and his orders were simple. But his attention was always on her. It wasn't predatory or uncomfortable. It was watchful, studious. He would ask her small questions while she refilled his water or cleared his plates. "Did you study art?" he asked one afternoon, nodding towards the small, abstract pin on her apron, one she had made herself. "Yes," she'd replied, surprised he'd even noticed it. "Art history," he would nod, a thoughtful expression on his face, and say nothing more. Another time, he asked, "Do you enjoy this work?" The question was direct, and she gave him a direct answer. "It pays the bills." Enjoyment is a luxury. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes. A strange, unspoken rapport began to grow between them. She was no longer just the waitress. He was no longer just the terrifying mafia boss from Table 12. They were 2 people occupying a small, quiet space for an hour at a time. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the quiet challenge of his presence. He was the only customer who saw past her uniform, who seemed interested in the person inside it. She learned to read his moods from the subtle set of his jaw or the way he held his shoulders. He, in turn, seemed to be learning her. He noticed when she was more tired than usual and would finish his meal quickly. He noticed when she had a new pin on her apron. It was a professional arrangement, a server and her regular, but it felt like something more. It felt like being slowly, carefully discovered. The danger he represented hadn't vanished. She saw it in the black car that always waited for him, in the way other patrons instinctively avoided his gaze, but it became a known quantity, a part of the strange, compelling landscape that was him. The professional arrangement shifted into a personal one with a quiet, unexpected offer. "I am hosting a small dinner party at my home next month," Min-jun said one afternoon, folding his newspaper with precise movements. "My regular caterer is unavailable. I would be willing to pay you 3 times your restaurant's rate to oversee the service." Simone stared at him, the water pitcher in her hand suddenly feeling immensely heavy. Go to his home. The place where the man who commanded such fear and power lived? Every rational thought screamed no. It was a line, a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. Her life was complicated enough without willingly stepping into the orbit of a known gangster. But then she thought of her mounting student debt, of the landlord's increasingly sharp notices. 3 times her rate for one night's work would solve so many problems.
It was just a job, she told herself.
A professional service. And she was a professional. Besides, a deeper, more reckless part of her was curious. She wanted to see the world he inhabited, the space that contained the man who asked about her art and understood that enjoyment was a luxury. Okay, she heard herself say, the single word feeling both foolish and inevitable. I'll do it the night of the dinner party. A black car, the same one that always waited for him, picked her up from her small apartment. The driver was silent and impassive. They drove to a part of the city she had only ever seen in magazines, a neighborhood of high walls and discreet security cameras. His house was not what she expected. It wasn't the gaudy mansion, but a stunning piece of modern architecture, all clean lines, glass, and dark wood, filled with a collection of art that made her art historian heart ache with envy. It was a space of immense quiet and control. She spent the evening in the kitchen, directing the 2 chefs he had hired, ensuring the small, intimate dinner for 6 went flawlessly. Minjun was the perfect host, charming and attentive to his guests, the same men from the restaurant. But throughout the night, Simone felt his awareness of her. A quick glance as she entered the dining room, a brief nod of approval. After the guests had departed, he found her in the kitchen, overseeing the cleanup. You are very good at this, he said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact. Thank you, Mr. Kang Min-jun, he corrected her gently. My home is not a restaurant. He stood there for a moment, watching her, and the space between them felt charged with all the things they never said.
He was a mafia boss.
She was a waitress. And yet, in the quiet of his beautiful, empty house, they were just a man and a woman, caught in a gravitational pull neither of them understood. The crisis came without warning. It was a month later, during a second catering job at his home. This one was smaller just for him. He had claimed he was tired of restaurant food. Simone knew it was an excuse, a way to continue their strange, undefined relationship away from public eyes. She was preparing a simple meal in his vast, silent kitchen when the world tilted on its axis. There was no loud explosion, no spray of bullets. There was only the sudden, chilling sound of the front door splintering inward, followed by the heavy tread of unwelcome feet in the foyer. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. She dropped the knife she was holding, its clatter on the stone floor deafening in the sudden silence. Before she could even process what was happening, Minjun was there. He moved faster than she would have thought possible, his body a blur of dark motion. One moment he was in his study down the hall, the next he was in the kitchen, standing in front of her. His face was a mask of cold fury she had never seen before, his eyes chips of ice. Get behind me, he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He pushed her back toward the pantry, shielding her with his own body. He held no weapon, yet he seemed more dangerous than any man with a gun. 2 men appeared in the kitchen doorway. They were large and dressed in black, their faces grim. They were not his men. They saw Minjun, and then they saw her, cowering behind him. A slow, cruel smile spread across the face of the lead intruder. Well, Kang, the man sneered. We didn't know you had acquired a new hobby. The man's eyes lingered on Simone, and Minjun's posture changed. The cold fury solidified into something primordial, a killing rage. He took 1 step forward, placing himself more firmly between Simone and the threat. You will not look at her, Minjun said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than a shout. You will leave this house now, or you will not leave it alive. The air crackled with violence. Simone could barely breathe. She was seeing the other side of him now, not the quiet, thoughtful customer or the lonely man in a beautiful house. This was the Korean Mafia boss, the predator his enemies saw, and he was putting his life on the line to protect her. What happened next was a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. It was over in less than a minute. Minjun moved with a terrifying grace, a dancer of death. He used the intruder's momentum against them, a series of precise, devastating strikes to their joints and throats. There was the sickening crack of bone, a strangled gasp, and then two heavy thuds as the bodies hit the floor. He didn't kill them. He dismantled them. They were left broken and twitching on the pristine kitchen tiles. Minjun stood over them for a moment, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. Then, the rage receded from his face, replaced by a profound, raw vulnerability as he turned to look at Simone. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was pressed against the pantry wall as if trying to merge with it. The professional veneer, the carefully constructed distance between them, was shattered into a million pieces. She had seen the monster. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hand slightly outstretched, then let it drop. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. She could only shake her head, unable to find her voice. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the man who discussed art history with the man who had just incapacitated two armed intruders with his bare hands. He looked broken, not by the fight, but by her fear of him. The silence in the kitchen was thick with the smell of blood and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Minjun's private security team, alerted by a silent alarm, swarmed the house moments later, their efficiency as chilling as the violence that had preceded them. They removed the bodies, cleaned the floor, and restored order with a practiced, silent competence. It was as if it had never happened. But it had. It was imprinted on Simone's memory, and she could see in Minjun's eyes that it was imprinted on his, too. He led her to his study, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling, and poured her a glass of brandy with a hand that trembled slightly. He didn't drink his own. He just stood by the window, looking out into the darkness, his back to her. The distance between them felt like a chasm. "They saw you," he finally said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. That was their purpose.
It wasn't about me.
It was about finding a weakness. And tonight, I showed them 1 inch. He turned to face her, and the look on his face was one of devastating self-recrimination. The control, the stillness that had always defined him, was gone. In its place was a man who looked utterly exposed. "My world is not safe for you, Simone. I was a fool to bring you into it." A selfish fool. He walked over and knelt before her chair, a gesture of supplication that seemed so contrary to his nature it stole her breath. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You must go," he whispered, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. "I will give you enough money to disappear. To go anywhere you want. Start a new life where no one can find you. A life far away from me." His words were a lifeline, an escape hatch from the nightmare she had stumbled into. It was the sensible choice. The sane choice.
Run.
Forget him. Forget the art collection. Forget the quiet lunches and the terrifying violence. But as she looked down at him, at this powerful, feared Korean mafia boss kneeling at her feet, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man terrified of losing the one thing he had allowed himself to care about. She saw the king who had been given two flawed choices and was now trying to make the honorable one, to protect her by sending her away. The answer came to her with the same unshakable clarity as her answer about the king's sons. Running would be safer, but it would be a lie. Over the past few months, in the quiet spaces between water refills and art discussions, she had come to care for this complicated, dangerous man. To leave now would be to abandon him to the solitary world he had built for himself. She gently squeezed his hand. "And what if I don't want to go?" she asked, her voice steady. Minjun looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fragile hope. "Simone, you said they found your weakness," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Maybe they just found your humanity." He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw the full, unguarded truth in his eyes. It wasn't just protection or fascination. It was love. A fierce, desperate, and terrifying love. "To stay is a death sentence," he said, his voice thick. "No," she replied, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. The skin was rough with stubble. To leave would be, in that moment, the choice was made. It was not a choice born of logic or self-preservation, but of a deeper, more profound connection. He was a mafia boss, and his world was filled with darkness. But he was also her king, and she would not let him face his kingdom alone. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man offered a feast. "I love you," he confessed, the words torn from him, a truth he had likely never spoken aloud before. "Then I will be your wife," she said, the words feeling like the most natural promise in the world. And in the silent, book-lined room, surrounded by the ghosts of violence, a new, fragile, and dangerous future began.